Max Nordau, Degeneration, published in 1892. When reading Nietzsche's works in sequence, one has the impression, from the first to the last page, of listening to a raving maniac who, with flashing eyes, wild gestures, and foaming mouth, spews out a deafening torrent of words, occasionally bursting into maniacal laughter, uttering foul insults and curses, then leaps around in a dizzying dance, then lunges at the visitor or imaginary opponents with a threatening expression and clenched fists. As far as the endless stream of words reveals any sense at all, it shows a series of constantly recurring delusions, which have their basis in hallucinations and pathological organic processes, which will be demonstrated in the course of this chapter. Occasionally, a clear thought crops up, which, as is always the case with raving maniacs, takes the form of a peremptory assertion, like an order from a despot. Nietzsche does not even attempt to provide any proof. If the thought of the possibility of an objection arises in his mind, he either belittles or ridicules it, or he simply and brusquely decrees, "That is wrong." How much more reasonable is the theory which is represented, for example, by Herbert Spencer? Good is, according to this theory, what has always proved useful. It can thus claim validity as highly valuable, as valuable in itself. This way of explanation is also wrong, but at least the explanation itself is reasonable and psychologically attainable. This was a quote from the Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche adds, "This way of explanation is wrong too." End of quote. Punctum. Why is it wrong? How come it is wrong? Because Nietzsche commands it so. The reader has no right to ask for more. By the way, he contradicts almost every single one of his powerfully dictatorial dogmas himself. He says something and then its opposite, and both with the same vehemence, usually in the same book, often on the same page. Now and then he becomes aware of self-contradiction, and then he pretends that he wanted to entertain himself, to vent his anger at the reader. Now some obviously insane claims or sayings. The gay science. What does life mean? This is a quote. What does life mean? Life means to continually repel something that wants to die. Life means to be cruel and relentless against everything that becomes weak and old in us, and not only in us. End quote. People capable of thinking have always believed that life means continually absorbing something. The rejection of what has been used up is only a concomitant phenomenon of the absorption of new substances. Nietzsche's sentence expresses in a mysteriously poetic form the idea of the morning walk to the bathroom. Healthy people associate the concept of life with the idea of the dining room rather than the secret cabinet, meaning the closet for like when you go to the bathroom. Yeah. Another quote from Beyond Good and Evil. It is a subtlety that God learned Greek when he wanted to become a writer, and that he did not learn it better. End quote. Another quote. Advice as riddle. If the ribbon is not to break, you must first bite it. End quote. I have no explanation or interpretation of this profundity to offer. The passages quoted already give the reader an idea of Nietzsche's style of writing. It is always the same in the dozen of thicker or thinner volumes he published. His books have different, mostly characteristically exaggerated titles, but they are a single book. You can mix them up while reading, but you won't notice. They are a succession of incoherent one-liners, prose and rhymes without beginning or end. Rarely is a thought developed a little, rarely are several pages in a row connected by a unified intention, by a logically structured line of reasoning. Nietzsche had the unmistakable habit of throwing everything that ran through his head onto paper with feverish abandon. And when he had a pile together, he piled the scraps into the printing press, and there was a book. He himself proudly referred to this thoughtful sweep of words as, quote, aphorisms, and his admirers counted the incoherence of his speech as a particular merit. When we speak of a moral system of Nietzsche, we must not imagine that he developed one anywhere. There are only views scattered through all his books from the first to the last on questions of morality and on the relationship of man to the species and to the humankind and to the world, which together reveal something like a basic conception. This is what has been called Nietzsche's philosophy. His disciples, that is the already mentioned Raab, furthermore Excerpts, Schelvin and others, have tried to give this alleged philosophy a certain form and uniformity by selecting a number of passages from Nietzsche's books that corresponded to some extent with each other and bringing them together. According to this method, one could, of course, also set up a Nietzsche philosophy that would be exactly opposite to the one adopted by his disciples. For as I said, Nietzsche himself contradicts every one of his assertions at some point, and if one brazenly decides to be dishonest, to pay attention only to the doctrines of a certain kind and to ignore those of the opposite kind, then one can read a philosophical view or its stark opposite out of Nietzsche at will. After paraphrasing the main thesis of the first part of the Genealogy of Morals, Nordau says, I must draw the reader's attention to this passage in particular and ask him to look around at the babbling and clattering in his mind. So, Israel wanted to take her revenge on the whole world and therefore decided to crucify the Savior and thus created a new morality. Who was this Israel that conceived and carried out the plan? Was it a parliament, an office, a ruler, an assembly of the people? Was the plan first subjected to general deliberation and decision-making before, quote, Israel was able to carry it out? One must try to clearly visualize the process which Nietzsche describes as a premeditated, deliberate and purposeful one in all its factual details in order to see clearly the whole meaning of these series of words. Since the Jewish slave revolt of morality, life on earth, which until then had been a delight, at least for the strong and bold, for the nobles, for the masters, has become an ordeal. Since that state, unnaturalness has prevailed in which man diminishes, weakens, and gradually degenerates. For the basic instinct of the found human being, of the sound or healthy human being, is not selflessness and compassion, but selfishness and cruelty. This is Nietzsche's moral philosophy as it emerges, neglecting the contradictions from individual passages in his various books, namely The Human All Too Human, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morals. I want to take them seriously for a moment and criticize them before confronting them with Nietzsche's own straightforward assertions. Before confronting them with Nietzsche's own opposite, that is, contradicting assertions. First, the anthropological assertion. Man is said to have originally been a free-roaming solitary beast of prey, whose primal instinct was selfishness and the absence of any consideration for his fellow kind. This assertion contradicts everything we know about the beginnings of mankind. As far back as we look into prehistory, every discovery shows us that prehistoric man was a herd animal that could not possibly have survived if it had not possessed the instincts that make it possible to live in community. That is, compassion, sympathy, a sense of belonging, and a certain degree of selflessness. We already find these instincts in the apes, and if they seem to be lacking in the most human-like animals, the orangutan, if they seem to be lacking in the most human-like animals, the orangutan and gibbon, this is sufficient proof for some researchers that these animals are degenerate and in the process of extinction. It is therefore not true that man has at any time been a, quote, solitary wandering beast. Now the historical assertion. At first, mankind is said to have been dominated by master morality, to which master morality prevailed among mankind, to which every selfish act of violence seemed good, every act of selflessness evil. The reversed evaluation of actions and feelings is said to be the work of a so-called slave revolt. The Jews are supposed to have followed the so-called ascetic ideal, that is the morality of combating all desires, of despising all carnality, of pity, and of compassion, and also love of neighbor. In order to take revenge on their oppressors, the masters, the, quote, blonde beasts. The madness of this idea of a conscious and deliberate act of revenge by the action of the Jewish people I have already shown above. But is it true that our morality today, with its concepts of good and evil concepts, is an invention of the Jews, and that is directed against, quote, blonde beasts, an enterprise of slaves against a master race? The main doctrines of today's wrongly called Christian morality are 6 centuries before, have appeared 6 centuries before the emergence of Christianity, and that was in Buddhism. Buddha preached them not a slave but a king's son, and they became the moral teachings not of slaves, not of the oppressed, but precisely of the master race, the Brahmins, the real Aryans. Here are some of the Buddhist moral teachings from the Indian Dhammapada and the Chinese Fo Shu Hing Tsang King. Quote, speak to no one harshly. Dhammapada verse 133. Quote, let us live happily. Do not hate those who hate us. Always he who has compassion for every living being we called Arya, meaning holy. Guard your thoughts. Good is self-control in everything. I call him a Brahmin who, although free from every offense, patiently suffers reproaches, fetters, and blows. Use force against your enemy and you will increase his enmity. Defeat him with love and you will reap no subsequent pain. End quote. Is this slave or master morality? Is it the view of roaming beasts of prey or that of compassionate, selfless socialites? And this view did not originate in Palestine, but in India, precisely among the people of the Aryan conquerors who ruled over a subjugated race. Also in China, where at that time no conqueror set above also in China, where at the time no conqueror race set above subjugated race. Self-sacrifice for others, pity and compassion are supposed to be Jewish slave morality. Was the heroic ape that Darwin tells us about, according to Brehm, a Jewish slave who rebelled against the master race of blonde beasts? With the, quote, blonde beast, Nietzsche is obviously thinking of the Germanic tribes of the age of migrations of the peoples. They gave him the idea of the roaming beast of prey that attacks weaker people in order to satisfy its lust for blood and destruction. This beast of prey has never entered into contracts. Whoever is violent in work and deed, what has he to do with treaties? History teaches us that the blonde beast, that is the Teuton of the period of migrations, who had not yet been touched by the so-called slave revolt in morality, was a strong but peace-loving peasant who waged war not to indulge in murder, but to obtain farmland, and who always sought to conclude peaceful treaties first before resorting to the sword out of necessity. And the same so-called blonde beast developed the concept of allegiance to the highest power long before news of the so-called ascetic ideal of Jewish Christianity reached him. That is the view that it is glorious for a person to completely divest himself of his own self, to know honor only as a reflection of the honor of another to whom one has given oneself, and to sacrifice one's life even for the chief. So what remains of the entire Nietzsche system? We have recognized it as a collection of crazy assertions and windy sayings that cannot really be taken seriously, as they hardly have the strength of the smoke rings of a cigar. Nietzsche's disciples always mumble about the, quote, depth of his moral philosophy, and in his case the words deep and depth are an intellectual tic that is constantly repeated in the most unpleasant way. But if you approach this depth, so-called depth, with the intention of measuring it, you can hardly believe your eyes. Nietzsche did not think a single one of his so-called thoughts true to the end. Not a single one of his wild assertions is carried just a finger's breadth below the outermost surface so that it could resist at least the weakest blow. The whole history of philosophy probably records no other example of people having been pleased to pass off such railroad entertainment jokes and tea-table beautiful spiritedness for philosophy, and now even for, quote, deep philosophy. Nietzsche does not see the moral problem at all, which he has been waffling around for 10 volumes. Reasonably, this problem can only be: can human actions be divided into good and evil? Why should the one be good and the other evil? What should compel man to do the good and refrain from the evil? Nietzsche acts as if he were denying the justification of a classification of human actions according to moral points of view. Quote from Nietzsche, nothing is true, everything is permitted, end quote. There is no good and no evil. It is a superstition and hereditary prejudice to hold on to these artificial concepts. He himself is, quote, beyond good and evil, and he invites the, quote, free spirits, the, quote, good Europeans, to follow him on this point of view. And immediately afterwards, this so-called free spirit, standing beyond good and evil, speaks with the greatest imperturbability of the, quote, aristocratic virtues and of master morality. So there are virtues, so there is a morality, even if it is opposed to the prevailing one. How is this compatible with the denial of all morality? So people's actions are not equal, so meaning in value, in a value sense. So one can distinguish between good and evil among them. Nietzsche thus undertakes to classify them, to describe some as virtues, quote, aristocratic virtues, and others as slave actions which are bad, that is, vicious. So he considers certain actions as slave actions, which are, from the standpoint of masters, those in command, as he says, bad and vicious. How can he then claim that he stands, quote, beyond good and evil? After all, he stands in the middle between good and evil, except that he allows himself the silly joke of calling evil what we call good, and vice versa, an act of the mind of which every naughty and mischievous child of 4 is truly capable. This first and most astonishing failure to grasp his own point of view is already a good example of his, quote, profundity. But further on, as a main proof that there is no morality at all, he cites what he calls the, quote, revaluation of values. What is now considered bad was once good and vice versa. We have seen that this idea is a delirious one and deliriously expressed. But suppose Nietzsche were right. Let us go into the madness and assume that a slave revolt in morality has taken place. What would this gain for his basic idea and thesis? A revaluation of, quote, values would prove nothing against the existence of morality at all, for it leaves the concept of value itself completely untouched. According to this, there are values, only that one kind of action is given the rank of value, then another kind of action. The fact that the views of what is moral or immoral have changed in the course of history, that they continue to change, that they will continue to change in the future, is not denied by any writer on moral history. Their recognition has become a commonplace. When Nietzsche considers it his discovery, he simply deserves to be dog-eared by a village school teacher's assistant. But how should the change of moral concepts, contradict the basic fact of the existence of moral concepts at all? Not only does it not contradict it, it even confirms it. It has it as a necessary precondition. A change in moral concepts is only possible if there are moral concepts, but that is precisely the problem. Are there moral concepts? And this first and only important question is not at all approached by Nietzsche with all his verbiage about the, quote, revaluation of values and the slave revolt in morality.